Picture this: you walk into what you believe is the interview of your dreams, wearing your best suit, carrying years of preparation and hope in your briefcase. 90 minutes later, you're standing in a parking garage, tears threatening to spill, holding a business card that will expose the biggest corporate conspiracy you've ever imagined. That business card didn't just change my career trajectory, it unraveled a web of systematic discrimination that had been destroying dreams for over 15 years. What I'm about to share with you will make you question everything you think you know about merit-based hiring in corporate America. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most devastating rejections are actually the universe redirecting you towards something infinitely more important than what you originally wanted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Amanda Chen, and I'm 31 years old. Growing up in a small apartment above my grandmother's restaurant in San Francisco's Richmond district taught me that success required twice the effort and triple the persistence when you didn't have connections opening doors for you. While other kids spent summers at camps or beach houses, I spent mine learning the value of hard work by helping serve customers and balance books downstairs. My parents, both immigrants from Taiwan, sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. My father worked double shifts at a tech startup while my mother managed the restaurant's finances and somehow still found time to help me with homework every single night. They spoke broken English, but their dreams for my future were crystal clear. I would become the first person in our family to graduate from college, and I would build the kind of career that would make all their sacrifices worthwhile. Throughout high school, I maintained a perfect GPA while working weekends at the restaurant. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, constantly reminded me that colleges would see past my modest background if my achievements spoke loudly enough. Stanford accepted me with a partial scholarship, and for the first time, my parents cried tears of joy instead of exhaustion. College opened my eyes to worlds I'd never imagined. My roommate Jennifer came from a family where attending Stanford was expected rather than miraculous. She casually mentioned family friends who worked at major corporations, summer internships arranged through family connections, and networking events that were just part of her social calendar. Meanwhile, I applied to hundreds of internships, crafting each cover letter with meticulous care, hoping someone would take a chance on the girl with no industry connections but unlimited determination. During my junior year, I landed an internship at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown San Francisco. The work was challenging and rewarding, but more importantly, it showed me what was possible when I was given a real opportunity to prove myself. My supervisor, Karen Martinez, became an unexpected mentor who saw potential in me that I was still learning to recognize in myself. Karen had grown up in similar circumstances, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who cleaned office buildings to pay for her education. She understood the unique challenges of being a first-generation professional and took me under her wing in ways that went far beyond typical internship supervision. She taught me how to navigate office politics, how to present ideas with confidence, and how to demand the respect my work deserved. By my senior year, I had earned a reputation as someone who delivered exceptional results. My capstone project analyzing market trends for emerging technologies received recognition from the business school dean and attracted attention from several major firms. Professor Williams, who oversaw the project, encouraged me to set my sights high when considering post-graduation opportunities. After graduating summa cum laude with a degree in business economics, I felt ready to take on the corporate world. My resume showcased internship successes, academic achievements, and leadership positions that demonstrated both competence and character. Karen had taught me to present myself with confidence, and I truly believed that merit would open the doors that family connections couldn't. The reality of job searching proved more challenging than my optimistic expectations had prepared me for. While classmates with family networks secured positions through personal referrals, I relied on online applications and career fairs to find opportunities. The process was longer and more frustrating than I'd anticipated, but I remained convinced that persistence would eventually pay off. After 6 months of applications, interviews, and polite rejections, I began to notice troubling patterns in my interactions with potential employers. First-round interviews typically went exceptionally well. Hiring managers seemed impressed with my qualifications, my analysis of their business challenges, and my proposed solutions. I could sense genuine enthusiasm for my candidacy during these initial conversations. However, something consistently shifted during second and third-round interviews. The questions would gradually move away from my professional capabilities toward more personal territory. Interviewers would ask about my family background, my hobbies, whether I was comfortable in high-pressure social situations with clients, and if I had experience with activities like golf or sailing that seemed irrelevant to the actual job requirements. The most memorable of these experiences occurred during an interview with Hartwell Consulting, one of San Francisco's most prestigious strategy firms. The first interview with their HR director went brilliantly. She seemed genuinely excited about my background and immediately scheduled me for the partner round, describing it as a formality before extending an offer. The partner meeting took place in a conference room overlooking the bay, with 3 senior executives who initially seemed interested in my case study presentation. However, as the conversation progressed, their questions became increasingly personal and uncomfortable. One partner asked where I had grown up, and when I mentioned the Richmond district, his expression subtly changed. Another inquired about my parents' professions, and I sensed a shift in the room's energy when I explained their backgrounds. The third partner asked whether I would be comfortable representing the firm at client events that might involve cultural activities I might not be familiar with, a question that felt loaded with implications I couldn't quite articulate. Despite answering every question professionally and confidently, I left that interview with a sinking feeling that had nothing to do with my qualifications or performance. 2 days later, I received a polite rejection email citing cultural fit as the primary concern, though they acknowledged my impressive credentials. This pattern repeated itself at firm after firm. Initial enthusiasm followed by increasingly personal questioning, then rejections based on vague cultural concerns rather than professional capabilities. Each rejection chipped away at my confidence and made me question whether I was somehow misreading situations or lacking skills I hadn't recognized. My friend Jessica, whom I'd met during my Stanford internship program, experienced similar patterns during her job search. She was a brilliant African-American woman from Oakland who had graduated at the top of her class from UC Berkeley's business program. Despite her outstanding academic record and proven internship success, she faced rejection after rejection from firms that claimed she wasn't quite the right fit for their organizational culture. We would meet for coffee and commiserate about the frustrating disconnect between our qualifications and our job search results. Jessica often wondered aloud whether there were invisible barriers we weren't recognizing, factors beyond our professional capabilities that were influencing hiring decisions. Her observations were perceptive and troubling, but neither of us had concrete evidence to support our growing suspicions. During this period, I supplemented my job search by working part-time at a financial planning office in Chinatown, helping families navigate retirement planning and college savings strategies. The work was meaningful because I was serving a community that reminded me of my own family's journey, but it wasn't the career-launching opportunity one needed to justify my parents' sacrifices and my own ambitions. My parents never expressed disappointment in my extended job search, but I could see the concern in their eyes. They had invested everything in my education, working extra hours and delaying their own retirement to ensure I could focus on my studies. The longer my search continued, the more I felt like I was failing to deliver on the promise my success represented for our entire family. Karen, my former supervisor, remained encouraging and offered to serve as a reference for any opportunity that seemed promising. During one of our monthly check-in calls, she mentioned hearing about some questionable hiring practices at larger firms, suggesting that the challenges I was experiencing might reflect systemic issues rather than personal shortcomings. Her words were comforting but also deeply concerning. If qualified candidates were being systematically excluded, what did that mean for others facing similar barriers? The financial pressure of extended unemployment was becoming increasingly stressful. My savings from internships and part-time work were dwindling, and I was reluctant to burden my parents with my living expenses when they were already stretched thin. The emotional toll was equally challenging, as each rejection reinforced doubts about my worth and capabilities that I knew were irrational but couldn't shake. It was during this particularly difficult period that I came across a posting for a senior analyst position at Meridian Financial, one of the most respected investment firms on the West Coast. The job description aligned perfectly with my skills and interests, focusing on market analysis and client strategy development. More importantly, the company had a reputation for innovative thinking and diversity initiatives that suggested they might value merit over connections. The application process for Meridian Financial felt different from the beginning. Their initial screening focused entirely on technical capabilities and analytical skills rather than personal background information. The first-round interview was conducted by their head of research, Dr. Patricia Kim, a Korean-American woman who had built an impressive career in financial analysis. Dr. Kim's interview style was refreshingly direct and professional. She challenged me with complex market scenarios, asked detailed questions about my analytical methodologies, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives on emerging trends in the financial sector. For the first time in months, I felt like I was being evaluated purely on my professional capabilities. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from macroeconomic theory to specific case studies I had worked on during my internships. Dr. Kim's feedback was immediately positive, and she scheduled me for the final round with the executive team within the week. Her enthusiasm felt genuine and based on substantive assessment of my qualifications rather than superficial compatibility concerns. As I prepared for the final interview at Meridian Financial, I allowed myself to hope that this might finally be the opportunity that would launch my career and validate years of hard work. The position offered everything I had been searching for: challenging analytical work, client interaction, professional development opportunities, and compensation that would allow me to begin paying back my parents for their sacrifices. The night before the interview, I spent hours reviewing the firm's recent publications, researching the backgrounds of the executives I would meet, and practicing responses to potential questions. My preparation felt more thorough and confident than it had in months, partly because Dr. Kim's enthusiasm had restored my belief that merit could overcome other considerations. I selected my most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that projected competence without being flashy, and prepared copies of my portfolio showcasing the analytical work that had earned recognition throughout my academic and internship experiences. Everything about this opportunity felt aligned with my capabilities and career goals, and I went to sleep that night more optimistic than I had been since beginning my job search. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of the interview, I arrived at Meridian Financial's offices in the financial district 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review my notes and center myself mentally. The building was impressive but not ostentatious, reflecting the firm's reputation for substance over style. The lobby featured awards for community service and diversity initiatives, reinforcing my sense that this company might operate differently than others I had encountered. Dr. Kim greeted me personally and escorted me to the executive conference room, where I would meet with the 5-person leadership team. She seemed even more enthusiastic than she had during our first interview, mentioning that she had shared positive feedback about our conversation with her colleagues. Her confidence in my candidacy helped calm my nerves and reminded me to trust in my preparation and qualifications. The executive team included CEO Robert Morrison, CFO Linda Zhang, Head of Client Relations David Park, Director of Operations Michelle Carter, and Chief Investment Officer Thomas Wilson. The diversity of the leadership team was immediately encouraging, suggesting that the company's commitment to inclusion extended beyond public statements to actual practice. The interview began exactly as I had hoped, with detailed discussion of my analytical approach to market research and specific examples of insights I had generated during my internships. The executives asked sophisticated questions that demonstrated genuine interest in my thinking process and professional capabilities. For the first 45 minutes, the conversation felt like exactly the kind of substantive professional exchange I had been hoping to find. My confidence grew as I successfully navigated complex questions about portfolio theory, risk assessment methodologies, and client communication strategies. The executives seemed impressed with my responses, and several mentioned specific projects at Meridian that would benefit from my analytical approach. I began to believe that this interview might finally result in the career opportunity one had been working toward for so many months. However, as the interview progressed into its second hour, I began to notice a subtle shift in the types of questions being asked. The focus gradually moved away from my professional qualifications toward more personal territory, though the transition was so gradual that I initially didn't recognize the pattern I had experienced at other firms. The shift began when CEO Robert Morrison leaned back in his chair and asked, "Amanda, tell us about your family's background. We like to understand what shapes our team members' perspectives." The question seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone reminded me of similar moments at other firms when conversations had taken uncomfortable turns. I explained my parents' journey from Taiwan, their restaurant business, and how their work ethic had inspired my own drive for excellence. As I spoke, I noticed subtle exchanges of glances between the executives that I couldn't quite interpret. David Park nodded politely, but his expression seemed to shift when I mentioned my grandmother's restaurant in the Richmond district. Michelle Carter followed up with questions about my comfort level in various social environments. Our clients often invite us to cultural events, gallery openings, wine tastings, and charity galas, she explained. These aren't just social occasions, they're opportunities to deepen client relationships. Do you have experience navigating those types of settings? The question felt loaded with implications I couldn't fully grasp. I answered honestly about attending university fundraisers and professional networking events, but I sensed my response wasn't what they were hoping to hear. Thomas Wilson then asked about my familiarity with luxury travel destinations and high-end restaurants, framing these as important for entertaining international clients. Each subsequent question moved further away from my professional qualifications and deeper into territory that felt increasingly personal and irrelevant to the actual job requirements. They asked about my hobbies, whether I played golf or tennis, if I was comfortable on boats, and whether I had experience with equestrian activities. When I mentioned that I enjoyed hiking and reading, Linda Zhang's polite smile seemed forced. The most uncomfortable moment came when Robert Morrison asked directly, "Amanda, our client base includes some of the Bay Area's most established families. Many have worked with our firm for generations and have certain expectations about who manages their wealth. Do you think you would be able to relate to their concerns and communication styles naturally?" The question hung in the air with obvious subtext that I was expected to decode. I responded by emphasizing my experience working with diverse client bases and my ability to adapt my communication style to different audiences, but I could sense that my answer wasn't addressing their underlying concern. Dr. Kim, who had been relatively quiet during this portion of the interview, finally spoke up. "I think Amanda's analytical skills and fresh perspective would be valuable assets for our client relationships," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge that suggested tension within the room. The interview concluded with polite thanks and promises to be in touch soon, but the energy in the room had shifted dramatically from the enthusiasm I'd felt during the first hour. As I gathered my materials and shook hands with each executive, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had somehow failed a test that had nothing to do with my ability to perform the job successfully. Dr. Kim walked me to the elevator, and for a moment, I thought she might offer some insight into what had just occurred. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for your time today, Amanda. Your qualifications are impressive." Her words were professional, but her tone suggested disappointment that seemed to extend beyond my individual candidacy. The elevator ride down to the lobby gave me time to replay the interview in my mind. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every firm that had initially expressed enthusiasm for my candidacy had ultimately shifted focus from my professional capabilities to personal characteristics that had nothing to do with job performance. The questions about family background, social activities, and cultural familiarity were consistently used to evaluate my fit rather than my competence. Walking back to my car, I felt the familiar mixture of frustration and self-doubt that had become a constant companion during my job search. The rational part of my mind knew that my qualifications were strong and my interview performance had been professional, but the repeated pattern of rejection was beginning to erode my confidence in ways that extended beyond career concerns. That evening, I called Jessica to debrief about the interview experience. She listened patiently as I described the shift from professional discussion to personal interrogation, and her response was both validating and deeply troubling. "Amanda, that's exactly what happened to me at Wellington Partners last month," she said. "They started with technical questions about financial modeling, then spent an hour asking about my comfort level with their client demographic. When I mentioned growing up in Oakland, the whole energy changed." Jessica had been documenting her interview experiences in detail, partly out of frustration and partly because she suspected there might be patterns worth examining more closely. As we compared notes, the similarities in our experiences became impossible to dismiss as coincidence or paranoia. Both of us had been asked about family backgrounds in ways that seemed designed to elicit information about socioeconomic status, rather than professional development. Questions about hobbies consistently focused on expensive activities that required significant disposable income rather than skills or interests that might be relevant to work performance. Discussions of client interaction repeatedly emphasized cultural familiarity and social comfort in elite environments rather than communication skills or relationship-building abilities. Most significantly, both of us had experienced the same pattern of initial enthusiasm followed by subtle but unmistakable cooling after these personal discussions. The shift was rarely dramatic enough to constitute obvious discrimination, but it was consistent enough to suggest systematic bias rather than individual preferences or coincidental personality conflicts. Jessica mentioned that her former roommate from Berkeley, Maria Santos, had experienced similar patterns while interviewing for positions at law firms throughout the city. Maria was a brilliant legal mind who had graduated Order of the Coif and edited Law Review, but she had faced rejection after rejection following interviews that focused more on her family's background as farm workers than her academic achievements and legal analysis skills. The three of us began meeting regularly to share experiences and provide mutual support during our respective job searches. Our informal group expanded to include other recent graduates who were facing similar challenges, and a troubling picture began to emerge of systematic barriers that seemed to affect qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds across multiple industries. These conversations were both comforting and deeply disturbing. On one hand, knowing that other capable professionals were experiencing similar patterns helped validate my growing suspicions that external factors beyond my control were influencing hiring decisions. On the other hand, recognizing the scope of the problem made it clear that individual effort and qualifications might not be sufficient to overcome systematic bias. During this period, I continued working part-time at the financial planning office in Chinatown while pursuing other job opportunities. The contrast between my interactions with clients there and my experiences during corporate interviews was stark and illuminating. The families I served valued my analytical skills, appreciated my cultural understanding, and respected my professional advice without questioning my background or social credentials. Mrs. Wang, an elderly client whose retirement planning I had helped optimize, often praised my ability to explain complex financial concepts in accessible terms. Mr. Liu, a small business owner, credited my investment recommendations with helping him achieve his goal of funding his daughter's medical school education. These interactions reminded me that my professional capabilities were strong and valuable, even when corporate hiring processes suggested otherwise. The financial planning work also provided insight into the real-world impact of the barriers I was experiencing. Many of the families I served had been excluded from traditional wealth management services because they didn't meet minimum asset requirements or because they felt intimidated by firms that seemed to cater exclusively to established wealth. The lack of diversity in financial services meant that entire communities were underserved by an industry that could significantly impact their economic mobility. This realization added urgency to my job search beyond personal considerations. If qualified professionals from diverse backgrounds were being systematically excluded from financial services, it meant that the industry was perpetuating inequality rather than helping address it. The stakes of overcoming hiring bias extended beyond individual career advancement to broader questions of economic justice and community empowerment. After 3 months of continued rejections from prestigious firms, I began expanding my search to include smaller companies and alternative opportunities that might value merit over cultural fit. However, even these supposedly more progressive organizations often exhibited subtle versions of the same bias patterns, suggesting that the problem extended beyond a few elite firms to broader industry culture. The emotional toll of repeated rejection was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Each interview felt like an audition for acceptance into a club that had unwritten membership requirements I couldn't satisfy regardless of my qualifications. The constant code switching required to navigate predominantly white professional environments was exhausting, and the persistent questioning of my legitimacy in these spaces was beginning to affect my sense of professional identity. My parents remained supportive throughout this period, but I could see the concern and confusion in their eyes. They had sacrificed enormously to provide me with educational opportunities, and they couldn't understand why those achievements weren't translating into career success. Their faith in the American promise of meritocracy was being tested by my experiences, and I felt responsible for their disappointment even though I knew the barriers I faced weren't my fault. Karen Martinez continued to serve as a mentor and sounding board during this difficult period. Her own experiences as a Latina professional in corporate America provided valuable perspective on the challenges I was navigating. She confirmed that many of the patterns I was observing reflected systematic issues that had persisted throughout her career, though she noted that they had become more subtle and legally careful over time. Karen's advice was both practical and philosophical. On the practical side, she helped me refine my interview strategies to anticipate and navigate inappropriate questions while maintaining my professional dignity. She also shared techniques for researching company cultures and identifying organizations that might be more genuinely committed to diversity and inclusion. Philosophically, Karen reminded me that my worth as a professional wasn't determined by the recognition or validation of biased institutions. She had built a successful career by focusing on organizations and opportunities that valued her contributions rather than trying to gain acceptance from those that questioned her legitimacy. Her perspective helped me maintain confidence in my abilities even when external validation was scarce. As summer turned to fall, I made the difficult decision to expand my geographical search beyond the Bay Area. While I preferred to stay close to my family and the community that had shaped me, the patterns I was experiencing locally suggested that broader opportunities might exist in markets where my background might be viewed differently. I began researching opportunities in cities like Seattle, Denver, and Austin, where tech growth and demographic diversity might create more progressive hiring environments. The prospect of relocating was daunting both financially and emotionally, but the alternative of remaining trapped in a cycle of qualified rejection seemed worse. However, before committing to relocation, I decided to pursue one final local opportunity that had emerged through an unexpected connection. Dr. Kim had reached out to inform me about a position at Pinnacle Investment Group, a firm that was expanding their analytical team and specifically seeking candidates with strong quantitative skills and fresh perspectives. Pinnacle's reputation was solid but not elite, which I hoped might mean they would focus more on capabilities than cultural fit. The position involved complex portfolio analysis and client communication, exactly the type of work I had been preparing for throughout my education and internships. Most importantly, Dr. Kim had specifically recommended me to their hiring manager, which suggested that at least one industry professional recognized my qualifications. The initial phone screening with Pinnacle's HR director, Sarah Thompson, was encouraging. She focused entirely on my technical background and seemed genuinely excited about my analytical approach to market research. She scheduled an in-person interview for the following week and mentioned that the team was eager to meet someone with my combination of academic training and practical experience. I approached the Pinnacle interview with cautious optimism, hoping that this opportunity might finally break the pattern of qualified rejection I had been experiencing. The firm's offices were located in a renovated warehouse in Soma, reflecting a more contemporary and casual culture than the traditional corporate environments I had previously encountered. The interview team included Portfolio Manager Jennifer Walsh, Senior Analyst Michael Rodriguez, and Director of Client Services Angela Kim. The diversity of the team was immediately encouraging, and their interview style focused heavily on technical problem-solving and analytical thinking rather than personal background or cultural fit concerns. Jennifer presented me with a complex market scenario and asked me to walk through my analytical approach in real time. The exercise was challenging but exactly the type of problem-solving I enjoyed most. Michael followed up with questions about risk assessment methodologies and client communication strategies that allowed me to demonstrate both technical knowledge and practical application skills. Angela's questions focused on my understanding of different client needs and communication preferences, but her approach emphasized professional adaptability rather than cultural background or social credentials. For the first time in months, I felt like I was being evaluated purely on my ability to perform the job successfully. The 3-hour interview covered everything from macroeconomic theory to specific client scenarios, and I left feeling genuinely optimistic about my prospects. The team's enthusiasm seemed authentic and based on substantive assessment of my qualifications rather than superficial compatibility concerns. Jennifer mentioned that they would make a decision within the week and seemed confident that I would be a strong addition to their team. True to their timeline, Pinnacle extended an offer 3 days later. The compensation was competitive, the work was exactly what I had been seeking, and the team culture emphasized collaboration and professional development. After months of rejection and self-doubt, receiving an offer based purely on merit felt like validation of everything I had been working toward. However, just as I was preparing to accept Pinnacle's offer, an unexpected opportunity emerged that would change not only my career trajectory but my entire understanding of the barriers I had been facing. Dr. Kim called to inform me about a senior analyst position at Apex Financial Partners, one of the most prestigious firms in the city, that had just become available due to an unexpected departure. Apex had a reputation for selectivity that bordered on exclusivity, but they also had industry-leading compensation and client portfolios that would provide unparalleled professional experience. Dr. Kim had maintained relationships with several executives at Apex from her earlier career and had specifically recommended me for consideration despite my previous struggles with similar firms. The opportunity at Apex represented everything I had originally hoped to achieve in my career: prestigious clients, complex analytical challenges, and compensation that would allow me to quickly repay my parents and establish financial security. However, pursuing the position also meant risking another devastating rejection just when I had finally found an opportunity that appreciated my qualifications. After extensive discussion with Karen, Jessica, and my parents, I decided to pursue the Apex opportunity while keeping Pinnacle's offer as a backup option. The decision was partly strategic and partly personal. I wanted to test whether my previous rejection patterns had been coincidental or systematic, and I needed to know if elite firms were truly inaccessible regardless of qualifications. Apex Financial Partners occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in the financial district, with panoramic views of the bay and interior design that screamed understated wealth. The elevator to their offices required a special key card, and the reception area featured original artwork and fresh orchids that were replaced daily. The initial interview was scheduled with senior partner Victoria Sterling, a woman whose reputation in the industry was legendary. Her background included Harvard Business School, Goldman Sachs, and founding roles at 2 successful hedge funds before joining Apex as their lead strategist. Meeting with someone of her caliber was both intimidating and exciting, if I could Impress Victoria Sterling, it would represent validation from the highest levels of the financial industry. Victoria's office overlooked the Golden Gate Bridge and was decorated with awards, photos with political leaders, and artifacts from around the world that spoke to both professional success and personal sophistication. She greeted me warmly and immediately began discussing complex market theories and analytical methodologies that demonstrated both her intellectual depth and genuine interest in my background. The conversation was intellectually stimulating and professionally challenging in ways that reminded me why I had been drawn to financial analysis in the first place. Victoria asked sophisticated questions about emerging market trends, risk assessment innovations, and client communication strategies that allowed me to demonstrate the full scope of my knowledge and analytical capabilities. For nearly 2 hours, we engaged in the type of substantive professional exchange I had been hoping to find throughout my job search. Victoria seemed genuinely impressed with my insights and mentioned several specific projects at Apex that would benefit from my analytical approach. Her enthusiasm felt authentic and based on careful evaluation of my technical qualifications, rather than superficial impressions. However, as our conversation progressed into its third hour, Victoria began asking questions that felt familiar from my previous interview experiences. She inquired about my family background, my comfort level with high net worth clients, and my familiarity with the social environments where business development often occurred. When I mentioned my parents' restaurant and my own more modest background, I noticed a subtle shift in Victoria's demeanor that I had learned to recognize from other interviews. Her questions became more pointed about my ability to relate to clients from established backgrounds and whether I would be comfortable representing Apex in exclusive social settings. The conversation concluded with polite thanks and promises to be in touch, but I left Victoria's office with the same sinking feeling that had become familiar throughout my job search. Despite demonstrating strong technical qualifications and engaging in sophisticated professional discussion, I sensed that my background had ultimately disqualified me from consideration for reasons that had nothing to do with job performance. 2 days later, I received a call from Victoria's assistant informing me that while my qualifications were impressive, they had decided to pursue other candidates who were better aligned with Apex's client demographic and organizational culture. The rejection was professionally delivered but carried the same coded language I had heard repeatedly throughout my search. The rejection from Apex Financial Partners arrived on a Thursday morning while I was having coffee with my grandmother at her restaurant. She had been watching me struggle through months of interviews and rejections with the quiet concern that only comes from someone who has experienced discrimination firsthand. When my phone rang with Victoria Sterling's assistant delivering the familiar coded rejection, my grandmother didn't need to hear the words to understand what had happened. "They don't deserve you," she said simply in Mandarin, her weathered hands covering mine across the small table where she tallied daily receipts. Her English was limited, but her understanding of prejudice was profound. She had spent decades serving customers who sometimes treated her as invisible, who spoke about her as if she couldn't understand their conversations, who questioned her right to own a business in their neighborhood. Her quiet dignity in the face of such treatment had always inspired me, but now I was beginning to understand the depth of strength it required. That afternoon, I called Pinnacle Investment Group to accept their offer, grateful that at least one firm had evaluated me based on merit rather than cultural assumptions. Jennifer Walsh seemed delighted by my decision and immediately began discussing start dates and onboarding procedures. Her enthusiasm was genuine and professional, focused entirely on my contributions to their analytical team rather than my suitability for their social environment. However, even as I prepared to begin what should have been an exciting new chapter, I couldn't shake the frustration and anger that had been building throughout my job search. The pattern of qualified rejection had become too consistent to ignore, and I felt a responsibility to understand what was happening not just for my own closure but for other candidates who might be facing similar barriers. During my final week before starting at Pinnacle, I decided to conduct an experiment that would either validate or disprove my growing suspicions about systematic bias in hiring practices. I created a modified version of my resume that emphasized different aspects of my background while maintaining complete honesty about my qualifications and experience. The modified resume listed the same educational achievements and professional experiences but included subtle changes that might signal different cultural background assumptions. Instead of mentioning my work at my grandmother's restaurant, I described volunteer experience at a community center. Rather than listing hiking and reading as hobbies, I added photography and travel. I changed my email address from one that included my full name to a more generic professional address. Using this modified resume, I applied to 3 positions at firms that had previously rejected me, curious whether different presentation might yield different results. The responses were swift and telling. Two of the three firms immediately requested interviews, despite having rejected my identical qualifications just months earlier. The third firm's HR director called personally to express enthusiasm about my background and schedule a meeting for the following week. The experiment confirmed what I had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Hiring decisions at these firms were being influenced by factors that had nothing to do with professional qualifications. The realization was both validating and deeply disturbing. If subtle changes in resume presentation could dramatically alter response rates, it meant that systematic bias was not only real but sophisticated enough to operate through coded signals and assumptions rather than explicit discrimination. I shared these findings with Jessica and Maria, who decided to conduct similar experiments with their own job searches. Jessica's results were even more dramatic than mine. Firms that had rejected her multiple times over the past year suddenly expressed interest when she submitted applications that de-emphasized certain aspects of her background while highlighting others. Maria's experience in the legal field revealed similar patterns. Law firms that had passed on her candidacy despite her outstanding academic credentials showed renewed interest when she resubmitted applications with strategic modifications. That signaled different cultural assumptions without changing any substantive qualifications. The three of us began documenting these patterns more systematically, creating a detailed record of how presentation changes affected response rates across multiple industries and firms. What emerged was clear evidence of systematic bias that operated through subtle cultural cues rather than explicit discrimination, making it difficult to identify and nearly impossible to challenge through traditional legal channels. As I prepared to start my position at Pinnacle, I felt conflicted about my upcoming role in an industry where I now understood systematic barriers were excluding qualified professionals who shared my background. The opportunity at Pinnacle was everything I had worked toward professionally, but accepting it also meant potentially becoming complicit in a system that I now recognized as fundamentally unfair. My first few weeks at Pinnacle were professionally rewarding in ways that reminded me why I had chosen financial analysis as a career path. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating, involving complex portfolio optimization problems and client communication strategies that utilized all of my analytical training. Jennifer Walsh proved to be an excellent supervisor who provided both autonomy and support, and my colleagues treated me as a valuable team member whose insights were respected and implemented. However, even within this more inclusive environment, I noticed subtle dynamics that reflected broader industry patterns. Client meetings occasionally involved coded discussions about cultural fit and relationship comfort that seemed to influence portfolio management decisions in ways that had little to do with investment performance. Some clients expressed preferences for working with specific team members based on factors that appeared unrelated to professional expertise. These observations reinforced my understanding that the bias I had experienced during my job search reflected deeper systematic issues within the financial services industry. Even firms that considered themselves progressive and inclusive operated within cultural frameworks that privileged certain backgrounds and perspectives while marginalizing others. During my second month at Pinnacle, an incident occurred that crystallized my understanding of how these dynamics operated in practice. We were presenting investment recommendations to a high-net-worth family who had recently moved their portfolio to our firm. The presentation went exceptionally well, with the clients expressing enthusiasm about our analytical approach and portfolio strategy. However, after the formal meeting concluded, the family patriarch pulled Jennifer aside for a private conversation. From across the conference room, I could see Jennifer's expression shift from professional confidence to obvious discomfort as they spoke. When the clients departed and Jennifer briefed our team on the conversation, the source of her discomfort became clear. The client had specifically requested that I not be involved in future meetings, citing concerns about communication compatibility and relationship dynamics that had nothing to do with my professional performance during the presentation. Jennifer was clearly frustrated by the request and emphasized that my analytical contributions would continue to drive their portfolio strategy regardless of meeting attendance, but the client's preference created an awkward situation that affected team dynamics. This incident was particularly troubling because it demonstrated how client bias could influence professional opportunities even within firms that valued diversity and inclusion. Despite Pinnacle's commitment to equitable treatment, external pressures from biased clients created limitations on my role that had nothing to do with my qualifications or performance. Jennifer handled the situation with as much integrity as possible, ensuring that my contributions remained central to the client's portfolio management while diplomatically managing their discriminatory preferences. However, the experience reinforced my understanding that systematic bias in financial services extended beyond hiring practices to ongoing client relationships and career development opportunities. As autumn progressed into winter, I found myself increasingly frustrated with the industry's systematic inequities even as my own career was advancing successfully. The cognitive dissonance of thriving professionally while witnessing ongoing discrimination against others created internal tension that I struggled to resolve. My conversations with Jessica and Maria continued to reveal similar patterns across their respective career paths. Jessica had eventually found a position at a smaller firm that valued her analytical skills, but she continued to face subtle barriers when interacting with certain clients and pursuing advancement opportunities. Maria had been hired by a progressive law firm that prioritized diversity, but she noticed that minority associates were disproportionately assigned to certain types of cases while being excluded from others. These ongoing patterns reinforced our collective understanding that individual success didn't address systematic barriers that continued to exclude qualified professionals from full participation in their chosen fields. Our informal support group had grown to include other young professionals who were navigating similar challenges across multiple industries, and our discussions increasingly focused on potential strategies for addressing systematic bias rather than simply surviving it. During this period, I received an unexpected phone call that would ultimately change my understanding of everything I had experienced during my job search. The caller identified herself as Patricia Wong, an investigative journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle who was researching hiring practices in the financial services industry. Patricia explained that she had been investigating patterns of discrimination at major financial firms for over a year, following up on tips from industry insiders who had observed systematic bias in hiring and promotion decisions. Her research had uncovered evidence of coordinated efforts to exclude certain candidates based on cultural and demographic characteristics rather than professional qualifications. She had obtained my contact information through professional networks and was reaching out because my educational background and interview experiences matched patterns she had identified in her investigation. Patricia was specifically interested in documenting the experiences of qualified candidates who had been systematically rejected by multiple firms despite strong credentials. Initially, I was hesitant to participate in her investigation, concerned about potential professional repercussions and uncertain about the value of publicizing personal experiences that felt both painful and potentially damaging to my career prospects. However, Patricia's thoroughness and the scope of evidence she had already gathered convinced me that my experiences were part of a larger pattern that deserved public attention. Patricia had documented similar experiences from dozens of other professionals across the Bay Area, revealing systematic bias that extended far beyond individual firm cultures to industry-wide practices that maintained demographic homogeneity through coded discrimination. Her investigation had uncovered internal communications, training materials, and hiring guidelines that explicitly referenced cultural fit criteria that were clearly designed to exclude certain demographic groups. The most damning evidence in Patricia's files included recorded conversations between hiring managers discussing strategies for rejecting qualified minority candidates without creating legal liability. These recordings revealed that firms were training interviewers to ask questions about family background, social activities, and cultural familiarity as proxy measures for demographic characteristics that couldn't be directly assessed without violating employment laws. One particularly disturbing recording featured executives from a major investment firm discussing how to maintain their preferred demographic composition while avoiding discrimination lawsuits. The conversation included specific strategies for creating pretextual reasons to reject candidates who didn't fit their cultural preferences, including the systematic use of subjective criteria like cultural fit and communication style to justify decisions based on bias rather than merit. Patricia's investigation had also revealed coordination between firms to share information about candidates who had been rejected for cultural fit reasons, effectively creating an informal blacklist that made it difficult for certain professionals to find positions anywhere in the industry. This coordination explained why my rejections had been so consistent across multiple firms despite strong qualifications and positive interview performances. The scope and sophistication of the systematic bias that Patricia had documented was staggering. It involved not just individual prejudices but coordinated institutional practices designed to maintain demographic exclusion while avoiding legal challenges. The evidence suggested that the barriers I had experienced were not accidental or incidental, but carefully constructed systems for preserving industry homogeneity. As I reviewed Patricia's documentation, I realized that my successful job search experiment with modified resumes had inadvertently revealed just one small aspect of a much larger systematic bias network. The firms that had responded differently to my alternative presentations were operating according to carefully developed protocols for identifying and excluding candidates based on coded demographic signals. Patricia's investigation had reached a critical juncture where she needed additional testimony from affected candidates to complete her reporting and build a compelling case for systematic reform. She explained that individual accounts of discrimination, no matter how well documented, could be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings unless they were presented as part of a clear pattern of systematic bias. My decision to participate in Patricia's investigation was ultimately driven by recognition that remaining silent about systematic discrimination would perpetuate the very barriers that had made my own job search so difficult. If qualified professionals continued to face these obstacles without public accountability, the industry would never be forced to confront its bias and implement meaningful reform. Patricia's reporting process was thorough and professional, involving detailed documentation of my interview experiences, analysis of the patterns I had observed, and verification of my qualifications and the rejections I had received. She was particularly interested in the systematic nature of the cultural fit questioning and the consistency of coded language used across multiple firms to justify rejections. The investigation also revealed that several firms had recently updated their hiring practices in response to legal concerns, implementing new training programs and evaluation criteria that were designed to maintain demographic preferences while reducing legal liability. These changes suggested that the industry was aware of its bias problems but was focused on managing legal risk rather than addressing systematic inequity. As Patricia prepared to publish her investigation, she contacted other journalists and legal experts who were working on related issues across different industries. Her research was part of a broader national conversation about systematic bias in professional hiring that was beginning to attract attention from civil rights organizations and federal enforcement agencies. The prospect of public attention for these issues was both exciting and intimidating. On one hand, exposing systematic bias represented an opportunity to create meaningful change that would benefit future candidates who might otherwise face the same barriers I had experienced. On the other hand, participating in such a high-profile investigation carried risks for my own career and professional relationships. Patricia assured me that her reporting would focus on systematic patterns rather than individual cases, and that my participation would be handled with appropriate sensitivity to protect my professional interests while contributing to broader accountability efforts. She had extensive experience investigating workplace discrimination and understood the delicate balance between public interest reporting and protecting the privacy and professional security of sources. As the investigation moved toward publication, I found myself reflecting on how my understanding of professional success and merit-based advancement had evolved over the past year. My experiences had revealed that individual qualifications and hard work, while necessary, were not sufficient to overcome systematic barriers that operated through coded bias and institutional exclusion. The recognition that my professional struggles reflected systematic rather than personal factors was both liberating and deeply troubling. It validated my sense that the rejections I had faced were unjustified while also revealing the scope of reform needed to create genuinely equitable opportunities in professional settings. My conversations with Jessica and Maria during this period focused increasingly on our responsibilities as professionals who had successfully navigated biased systems to advocate for others who continued to face barriers. We had all benefited from finding inclusive employers who valued our contributions, but we also recognized that our individual success didn't address the systematic problems that continued to exclude other qualified candidates. The three of us began discussing potential strategies for leveraging our professional positions to promote broader change within our respective industries. These conversations ranged from formal advocacy through professional organizations to informal mentoring of younger candidates who might be facing similar challenges in their own job searches. As Patricia's investigation neared publication, she shared preliminary findings that revealed the scope of systematic bias extended far beyond the financial services industry to include law firms, consulting companies, tech startups, and other professional sectors throughout the Bay Area. The patterns we had identified were not unique to finance but reflected broader cultural and institutional practices that maintained demographic homogeneity across multiple industries. The investigation had also uncovered evidence of coordination between firms across different sectors, suggesting that bias in professional hiring was not just systematic within individual industries but represented a broader network of institutional practices designed to maintain established demographic preferences throughout the professional economy. This broader context helped explain why alternative career paths had also presented similar challenges for many qualified candidates. The bias we had experienced was not unique to specific firms or industries but reflected deeper cultural assumptions about professional competence and cultural fit that operated across multiple professional settings. Patricia's reporting was scheduled for publication as a multi-part series that would examine different aspects of systematic bias in professional hiring, including the specific techniques used to exclude qualified candidates, the coordination between firms to maintain demographic preferences, and the broader economic and social impact of these practices on professional diversity and economic mobility. The anticipation of publication created both excitement and anxiety as I contemplated the potential impact of exposing these systematic practices to public scrutiny. The investigation represented an opportunity to create meaningful accountability for bias that had operated in shadows for decades, but it also carried uncertain consequences for everyone involved in bringing these issues to light. The weight of Patricia's revelations settled over me like a heavy blanket during the weeks leading up to publication. Knowing that my experiences were part of a carefully orchestrated system of exclusion was both validating and overwhelming. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying every interview rejection with new understanding, seeing the coded language and systematic patterns that I had sensed but couldn't fully comprehend at the time. My work at Pinnacle continued successfully, but I struggled to focus on portfolio analysis and client communications while grappling with the broader implications of what Patricia had uncovered. Jennifer noticed my distraction during team meetings and eventually asked if everything was all right. I wanted to confide in her about the investigation, but Patricia had emphasized the importance of maintaining confidentiality until publication to protect the integrity of her reporting. During this period, I spent countless hours reviewing the documented evidence that Patricia had shared with me. The recorded conversations were particularly disturbing because they revealed the casual, almost routine nature of discriminatory decision-making at firms I had once aspired to join. Executives discussed excluding qualified candidates with the same tone they might use to debate lunch plans, demonstrating how normalized these practices had become within industry culture. One recording that haunted me featured Catherine Sterling Pierce from Apex Financial Partners explaining to her management team how to identify candidates who might not fit their client demographic. Her voice was calm and professional as she outlined strategies for asking probing questions about family background, social activities, and cultural familiarity that would reveal information about candidates' socioeconomic origins without explicitly asking about protected characteristics. The sophistication of the systematic bias was staggering. These weren't crude stereotypes or obvious prejudices but carefully developed techniques for maintaining demographic homogeneity while avoiding legal liability. The firms had essentially created a parallel evaluation system that operated alongside official hiring criteria, allowing them to reject qualified candidates based on cultural assumptions while maintaining plausible deniability about their true motivations. Patricia's investigation had also revealed the existence of informal networks where hiring managers shared information about candidates who had been rejected for cultural fit reasons. These communications created an unofficial blacklist that made it nearly impossible for certain professionals to find positions anywhere in the industry, regardless of their qualifications or interview performance. I began to understand why my job search had been so consistently frustrating across multiple firms. It wasn't just that individual companies had biased hiring practices, but that they were coordinating their exclusion efforts to ensure that candidates they deemed culturally unsuitable couldn't find alternative opportunities within the industry. The systematic nature of the discrimination was far more comprehensive than I had ever imagined. The emotional impact of these revelations was complex and difficult to process. Part of me felt relieved to finally understand that my rejections weren't due to personal inadequacies or professional shortcomings, but another part felt angry and betrayed by an industry I had spent years preparing to join. The realization that merit and qualifications were secondary considerations in hiring decisions challenged fundamental assumptions I had held about professional advancement and economic mobility. My conversations with Jessica and Maria during this period were intense and cathartic. All three of us were grappling with similar revelations about systematic bias in our respective fields, and we found comfort in sharing our anger, disappointment, and determination to create change. Our informal support group had evolved into something more like an advocacy network as we discussed potential strategies for addressing the systematic problems we had uncovered. Jessica had connected with legal advocacy organizations that specialized in employment discrimination, and she was exploring potential class action lawsuits that could challenge systematic bias across multiple firms simultaneously. Her research had revealed that individual discrimination complaints were rarely successful because they were difficult to prove and easy to dismiss as isolated incidents or personality conflicts. Maria had begun working with civil rights attorneys who were investigating similar patterns in the legal profession, where minority law graduates were being systematically excluded from prestigious firms despite outstanding academic credentials. Her contributions to their research were helping build comprehensive documentation of bias patterns that extended across multiple professional industries. As Patricia's publication date approached, she asked if I would be willing to participate in follow-up interviews with other journalists and potentially testify before legislative committees that were examining employment discrimination in professional settings. The prospect of such high-profile involvement was both exciting and terrifying, representing an opportunity to create meaningful change while also exposing me to potential professional and personal risks. My decision to participate more actively in accountability efforts was influenced by conversations with my grandmother, whose perspective on discrimination and social justice had been shaped by decades of experience as an immigrant business owner. She reminded me that remaining silent about injustice only perpetuated the systems that harmed others, and that those who had successfully navigated biased institutions had a responsibility to advocate for those who continued to face barriers. The night before Patricia's investigation was scheduled for publication, I received an unexpected phone call that would dramatically escalate the stakes of our accountability efforts. The caller identified himself as Marcus Thompson, a senior custodial supervisor at Meridian Financial Group, one of the firms mentioned prominently in Patricia's reporting. Marcus explained that he had been working at Meridian for over 15 years and had observed patterns in their hiring practices that troubled him deeply. His position gave him access to executive areas during off hours, and he had overheard conversations and seen documents that provided additional evidence of systematic discrimination beyond what Patricia had already documented. He had learned about Patricia's investigation through industry networks and wanted to contribute information that could strengthen her reporting and potentially support legal action against firms engaged in discriminatory practices. Marcus emphasized that he was motivated by witnessing qualified candidates being rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with their professional capabilities. Marcus had been documenting suspicious hiring patterns for several months, keeping detailed records of candidate interviews and subsequent decision-making discussions that he had observed during his cleaning rounds. His unique position allowed him to witness unguarded conversations between executives who assumed their discrimination discussions were private and unobserved. The evidence that Marcus had collected was particularly valuable because it provided real-time documentation of discriminatory decision-making rather than retrospective analysis of hiring patterns. His recordings and written observations captured executives in the act of implementing bias protocols, discussing strategies for rejecting qualified minority candidates, and coordinating with other firms to share exclusion strategies. One of Marcus's most damning recordings featured Meridian executives planning how to handle upcoming interviews with qualified minority candidates. The conversation included specific instructions for asking probing personal questions designed to elicit information about candidates' socioeconomic backgrounds, followed by discussion of pretextual reasons for rejecting candidates who didn't fit their preferred demographic profile. Marcus had also documented coordination meetings between Meridian executives and representatives from other major firms where they shared strategies for maintaining demographic homogeneity while avoiding legal challenges. These meetings revealed the systematic and coordinated nature of industry-wide discrimination efforts that extended far beyond individual firm policies. His willingness to come forward with this evidence represented a turning point in accountability efforts because it provided insider documentation of discriminatory practices from someone with direct access to executive decision-making processes. Marcus understood the professional risks of exposing his employer's illegal practices, but he felt a moral obligation to speak out against systematic injustice. Patricia immediately recognized the significance of Marcus's evidence and worked with her legal team to ensure that his contributions were properly documented and protected. His status as a whistleblower provided certain legal protections, but Patricia wanted to minimize any potential retaliation risks while maximizing the impact of his revelations. The addition of Marcus's evidence to Patricia's investigation created a comprehensive documentation of systematic discrimination that would be difficult for the targeted firms to dismiss or minimize. The combination of victim testimony, statistical analysis, recorded conversations, and insider documentation created an overwhelming case for systematic bias that extended across multiple firms and involved coordination between industry players. As Patricia's series began publication, the response was immediate and dramatic. The first article, which focused on recorded conversations between executives discussing strategies for rejecting qualified minority candidates, generated widespread outrage and calls for federal investigation into industry hiring practices. Major news outlets picked up the story, and within days, the investigation was being discussed on national television, analyzed by legal experts, and generating responses from civil rights organizations across the country. The systematic nature of the discrimination and the sophistication of the exclusion strategies captured public attention in ways that individual discrimination complaints had never achieved. Federal agencies immediately announced investigations into the firms mentioned in Patricia's reporting, while state employment regulators began examining hiring practices across the financial services industry. Several law firms specializing in employment discrimination announced their intention to file class action lawsuits on behalf of affected candidates. The public response to the investigation was overwhelmingly supportive of accountability efforts, with widespread recognition that the documented practices represented serious violations of employment law and fundamental principles of equal opportunity. Social media discussions generated thousands of similar stories from professionals who had experienced systematic bias in their own job searches across multiple industries. However, the targeted firms initially responded with denials and attempts to minimize the significance of the documented evidence. Apex Financial Partners issued a statement claiming that the recorded conversations had been taken out of context and that their hiring decisions were based solely on professional qualifications and cultural compatibility with their client base. Meridian Financial Group attempted to discredit Marcus Thompson by questioning his motivations and suggesting that his evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. Their public relations team worked aggressively to frame the investigation as an attack on successful businesses by disgruntled former candidates and activist journalists. These defensive responses only intensified public scrutiny and media attention, as the firm's attempts to justify their practices revealed additional problematic attitudes about diversity and inclusion in professional settings. Their explanations for cultural compatibility requirements and client demographic preferences exposed the coded language and systematic thinking that had enabled discriminatory practices to persist. Within 2 weeks of publication, the legal and political pressure on the targeted firms became overwhelming. Federal investigators announced formal civil rights investigations, while congressional committees scheduled hearings on employment discrimination in professional industries. The Securities and Exchange Commission also announced that they would examine whether discriminatory hiring practices at financial firms constituted violations of fiduciary responsibilities to diverse investor populations. The first major breakthrough in accountability efforts came when Meridian Financial Group agreed to a comprehensive settlement with federal regulators that included substantial financial penalties, mandatory hiring practice reforms, and ongoing monitoring of their recruitment and selection processes. The settlement also included compensation for affected candidates and funding for diversity initiatives in financial services education. Marcus Thompson was formally recognized as a whistleblower and received both legal protection and financial compensation for his role in exposing systematic discrimination. His courage in coming forward had been instrumental in building the evidence needed to force meaningful accountability and reform within the industry. Apex Financial Partners initially attempted to fight the charges but eventually agreed to an even more comprehensive settlement after additional evidence emerged of coordination with other firms to maintain discriminatory hiring practices. Victoria Sterling was removed from all hiring responsibilities and required to undergo extensive training on employment law and bias prevention. The broader impact of Patricia's investigation extended far beyond the specific firms that were directly implicated. Financial services companies across the country began reviewing their hiring practices and implementing new training programs to avoid similar legal exposure. Industry associations developed new guidelines for recruitment and selection that emphasized objective qualifications and prohibited the types of cultural compatibility assessments that had been used to exclude qualified candidates. My own role in these accountability efforts evolved from reluctant participant to active advocate as I recognized the potential for creating meaningful change that would benefit future candidates facing similar barriers. I testified before congressional committees examining employment discrimination and participated in the development of new industry standards for equitable hiring practices. The experience of moving from victim to advocate was personally transformative in ways that extended far beyond professional considerations. Understanding that my experiences were part of a systematic problem rather than personal inadequacies fundamentally changed how I viewed my own worth and potential contributions to the financial services industry. My work at Pinnacle continued to thrive, but I also began developing expertise in diversity and inclusion initiatives that allowed me to contribute to broader reform efforts within the financial services sector. Jennifer Walsh supported my advocacy activities and eventually asked me to lead Pinnacle's own efforts to examine and improve their hiring and advancement practices. The investigation and subsequent accountability efforts also led to unexpected career opportunities that were more meaningful than the positions I had originally sought at biased firms. Organizations committed to genuine diversity and inclusion actively recruited professionals who had demonstrated both technical competence and principled advocacy for equal opportunity. 2 years after Patricia's investigation was published, I accepted a position as Director of Equity and Inclusion at a major investment firm that was committed to transforming industry culture around diversity and merit-based advancement. The role allowed me to combine my analytical background with advocacy experience to develop systematic solutions for bias prevention and inclusive recruitment. Marcus Thompson and I maintained regular contact as we both navigated our new roles as advocates for workplace equity. His perspective as a longtime industry insider provided valuable insights into institutional culture change, while my experience as an affected candidate helped inform policy development and implementation strategies. The broader impact of our accountability efforts continued to expand as other industries faced similar scrutiny and pressure for reform. Legal firms, consulting companies, and technology startups all implemented new hiring practices and bias prevention protocols in response to increased awareness of systematic discrimination issues. Jessica eventually started her own consulting firm specializing in diversity and inclusion strategy for financial services companies, drawing on her experiences navigating biased hiring practices to help organizations develop more equitable recruitment and advancement systems. Her work was particularly valuable because she understood both the technical requirements of financial analysis and the cultural barriers that had historically excluded qualified candidates. Maria became a civil rights attorney specializing in employment discrimination cases, using her legal expertise and personal experience with bias to advocate for systematic reform across multiple professional industries. Her work contributed to landmark legal precedents that strengthened enforcement of employment discrimination laws and expanded protections for affected candidates. The three of us often reflected on how our negative experiences with discriminatory hiring practices had ultimately led us to more meaningful careers focused on creating positive change within professional industries. While we would have preferred to avoid the discrimination and frustration we experienced, the understanding we gained about systematic bias enabled us to contribute to solutions in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. 5 years after Patricia's investigation was published, the financial services industry had undergone significant transformation in its approach to diversity and inclusion. While systematic bias hadn't been completely eliminated, the combination of legal accountability, public scrutiny, and cultural change had created meaningful progress toward more equitable hiring and advancement practices. My current role involves working with firms across the industry to develop bias-free recruitment strategies, implement objective evaluation criteria, and create advancement opportunities that are truly based on merit rather than cultural assumptions or demographic preferences. The work is challenging but deeply rewarding because it addresses the systematic problems that once seemed insurmountable. Looking back on my journey from frustrated job seeker to industry advocate, I'm struck by how individual experiences of discrimination can reveal broader systematic problems that require collective action to address effectively. My personal struggles with biased hiring practices were ultimately transformed into opportunities to create meaningful change that benefits countless other professionals facing similar barriers. The investigation that began with my own rejections and frustrations ultimately exposed industry-wide practices that had excluded qualified candidates for decades. The accountability and reform efforts that followed demonstrated that systematic discrimination, no matter how sophisticated or well-established, can be challenged and changed when victims find their voices and allies emerge to support truth-telling and justice. The business card that Marcus Thompson handed me in that parking garage 5 years ago didn't just change my career trajectory, it connected me to a network of advocates and reformers who were committed to creating more equitable professional opportunities for everyone. Sometimes the most devastating rejections redirect us toward purposes we never could have imagined, and sometimes the people who seem powerless hold the keys to transforming entire industries. Today, my work continues to focus on ensuring that professional success is determined by qualifications and character rather than cultural assumptions or demographic preferences. The systematic barriers that once seemed impossible to overcome have been replaced by opportunities to create positive change, and the journey from exclusion to advocacy has been more meaningful than any position I originally sought at those biased firms. 7 years have passed since that devastating afternoon when I walked out of Apex Financial Partners feeling like my dreams had been shattered beyond repair. Today, as I sit in my corner office overlooking San Francisco Bay, serving as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Western Investment Alliance, I often reflect on how that moment of crushing rejection became the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my life. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and the journey from victim to advocate required confronting painful truths about systematic inequality that extended far beyond my personal experiences. What began as a desperate attempt to understand why qualified candidates were being systematically excluded evolved into a comprehensive reform movement that has fundamentally changed how the financial services industry approaches hiring, advancement, and client relationships. My current role involves overseeing diversity initiatives across a network of 12 investment firms that collectively manage over $200 billion in assets. The position requires me to balance the analytical skills I developed during my early career with the advocacy expertise I gained through fighting systematic discrimination. Every day brings new challenges in creating equitable opportunities, while maintaining the highest standards of professional excellence. The work is complex because it requires changing not just policies and procedures but deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about merit, qualifications, and professional competence. Many executives who had built successful careers within biased systems struggled to understand how their own advancement might have been facilitated by the same barriers that excluded others. Creating awareness of these dynamics without generating defensiveness or resentment required developing sophisticated communication strategies and change management approaches. One of the most rewarding aspects of my current position is mentoring young professionals who are navigating challenges similar to those I faced during my own job search. These conversations often remind me of how isolating and demoralizing it can feel to repeatedly face rejection despite strong qualifications and excellent interview performance. The difference now is that emerging professionals have resources and support systems that didn't exist when I was searching for opportunities. Last month, I met with Sarah Kim, a recent graduate from UC Berkeley's business program whose academic achievements and internship experiences rivaled my own from years earlier. She had been facing the same pattern of qualified rejections that I remembered so painfully, and her frustration was evident as she described interviews that seemed to go well until conversations shifted toward personal background and cultural compatibility concerns. Working with Sarah allowed me to provide the kind of guidance and support that I had desperately needed during my own job search. Instead of leaving her to navigate systematic bias alone, I was able to connect her with firms that had demonstrated genuine commitment to equitable hiring practices and help her develop strategies for identifying organizations where her talents would be truly valued. Sarah's successful placement at a progressive investment firm reminded me why the advocacy work is so important. Individual success stories like hers represent victories not just for specific candidates but for broader principles of merit-based advancement and equal opportunity. Every qualified professional who finds meaningful employment in spite of systematic barriers validates the reform efforts and demonstrates the value of persistent advocacy. The systematic changes that emerged from Patricia Wong's investigation and the subsequent accountability efforts have created measurable progress throughout the financial services industry. Annual diversity reports now show significant increases in the recruitment and retention of professionals from previously excluded demographic groups, while client satisfaction surveys indicate that diverse teams are delivering superior investment performance and relationship management. However, the progress hasn't been uniform across all firms or consistent in all aspects of professional advancement. While entry-level hiring has improved dramatically, leadership development and partnership tracks still reflect legacy bias patterns that are more difficult to address through policy changes alone. Cultural transformation at senior levels requires longer-term strategies and sustained commitment from organizational leaders who must be willing to examine their own assumptions and privileges. My work frequently involves consulting with firms that are genuinely committed to change but struggling to implement effective diversity initiatives. These organizations often discover that good intentions aren't sufficient to overcome systematic barriers that have been embedded in their cultures for decades. Creating meaningful change requires comprehensive approaches that address recruitment, advancement, mentoring, client development, and leadership accountability simultaneously. One particularly challenging project involved working with Hartwell Consulting, one of the firms that had rejected me during my original job search. The company's leadership had recognized that their hiring practices were problematic and wanted to implement reforms that would attract and retain diverse talent. However, their initial efforts had been unsuccessful because they focused on changing policies without addressing underlying cultural assumptions. The transformation process at Hartwell required 18 months of intensive work that included bias training for all employees, revision of evaluation criteria, implementation of structured interview processes, and development of mentoring programs specifically designed to support professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. The most difficult aspect was helping senior partners recognize how their own career advancement had been facilitated by the same informal networks and cultural preferences that excluded others. The results at Hartwell have been encouraging but incomplete. Their recruitment of diverse candidates has improved significantly, and their retention rates have stabilized after years of losing talented professionals who felt marginalized within the firm's culture. However, advancement to senior positions continues to lag behind industry benchmarks, indicating that deeper cultural work is still needed to address systematic barriers at leadership levels. These ongoing challenges remind me that reform is a continuous process rather than a destination that can be reached through specific policy changes or training programs. Systematic bias operates through subtle cultural dynamics that require persistent attention and adaptive strategies to address effectively. The work of creating genuinely equitable organizations will likely continue for many years as industries grapple with legacy practices and evolving understanding of inclusion principles. My collaboration with Marcus Thompson has continued to evolve as we both developed expertise in organizational change and systematic reform. His perspective as a longtime industry insider provides valuable insights into the informal networks and cultural practices that often determine career advancement opportunities. Our partnership has become a model for how individuals with different backgrounds and experiences can work together to create positive change. Marcus now serves as Director of Workplace Equity at a major consulting firm that specializes in diversity and inclusion initiatives across multiple industries. His transition from custodial supervisor to executive leadership represents one of the most dramatic career transformations to emerge from our accountability efforts. His success demonstrates that talent and insight can be found in unexpected places when organizations commit to recognizing and developing potential rather than maintaining traditional hierarchies. Our ongoing work together involves developing assessment tools that help organizations identify systematic bias in their hiring, advancement, and client relationship practices. These instruments go beyond traditional diversity metrics to examine the subtle cultural dynamics that often determine whether talented professionals thrive or struggle within specific organizational environments. The assessment process typically reveals that systematic bias operates through multiple interconnected mechanisms rather than single discriminatory practices. Organizations might have equitable recruitment processes but biased advancement criteria, or they might support diverse entry-level hiring while maintaining exclusive client development opportunities. Addressing these complex patterns requires comprehensive approaches that examine all aspects of professional development and career progression. Jessica Martinez's consulting firm has become one of the most respected diversity strategy organizations in the financial services industry, working with companies across the country to develop inclusive cultures and equitable advancement opportunities. Her success represents validation of the expertise that emerges from lived experience with systematic barriers combined with professional competence and strategic thinking. Jessica's approach emphasizes the business case for diversity while also addressing moral and legal imperatives for equal opportunity. Her research has demonstrated that diverse teams consistently outperform homogeneous groups on complex analytical tasks, risk assessment challenges, and client relationship management. These findings help organizations understand that inclusion initiatives benefit overall performance rather than simply meeting compliance requirements. The consulting work that Jessica leads often involves helping organizations recognize the economic costs of systematic bias in addition to its ethical problems. When qualified candidates are excluded from consideration, companies lose access to talent that could drive innovation and improve performance. When diverse professionals leave organizations due to cultural barriers, firms lose their investment in recruitment and training while also missing opportunities for retention and advancement of proven capabilities. Maria Santos's legal practice has expanded to include systematic reform litigation that addresses industry-wide discrimination patterns rather than focusing solely on individual complaints. Her work has contributed to several landmark settlements that have created precedents for comprehensive accountability and organizational transformation in response to systematic bias. The legal strategies that Maria develops often involve coordinated actions across multiple firms and industries, recognizing that systematic discrimination rarely occurs in isolation but typically reflects broader cultural patterns that require comprehensive responses. Her success in building coalitions of affected professionals and advocacy organizations has created new models for challenging institutional bias through collective action. One of Maria's most significant recent victories involved a class action settlement with a consortium of investment firms that had been coordinating their exclusion of qualified minority candidates for over a decade. The settlement included not only financial compensation for affected individuals but also mandatory implementation of bias prevention systems and ongoing monitoring by independent oversight organizations. The three of us often reflect on how our individual experiences with discrimination ultimately led to career paths that were more meaningful and impactful than the positions we had originally sought at biased firms. While we would have preferred to avoid the frustration and rejection we experienced, the understanding we gained about systematic barriers enabled us to contribute to solutions in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. Our monthly meetings have evolved from support sessions focused on personal struggles to strategic planning discussions about broader reform initiatives and policy advocacy. We frequently collaborate on research projects, conference presentations, and legislative testimony that draws on our combined expertise in finance, law, consulting, and organizational change. The impact of our advocacy work extends beyond the financial services industry to influence diversity initiatives in technology, healthcare, consulting, and other professional sectors where similar bias patterns have been identified. The accountability model that emerged from Patricia Wong's investigation has been replicated by journalists and researchers examining systematic discrimination in multiple industries across the country. Patricia herself has become a leading investigative reporter specializing in workplace equity issues, with her subsequent reporting contributing to reforms in legal services, technology startups, healthcare organizations, and academic institutions. Her methodology for documenting systematic bias through insider testimony, statistical analysis, and recorded evidence has become a template for exposing institutional discrimination across various professional settings. The broader cultural impact of these accountability efforts is evident in changing conversations about merit, qualifications, and professional advancement throughout corporate America. Organizations that once relied on informal networks and cultural compatibility assessments are increasingly adopting structured evaluation processes that emphasize objective criteria and demonstrated capabilities. However, the progress hasn't eliminated all forms of bias or created perfectly equitable opportunities across all professional settings. Systematic discrimination has in some cases become more subtle and sophisticated rather than disappearing entirely. Contemporary bias often operates through algorithmic selection processes, cultural coding in job descriptions, and informal networking practices that maintain exclusionary effects while avoiding obvious legal violations. My current work increasingly focuses on identifying and addressing these evolving forms of systematic bias before they become as entrenched as the practices we successfully challenged in the financial services industry. This requires staying ahead of technological and cultural trends that might create new barriers while also maintaining vigilance about persistent legacy biases that continue to operate through updated mechanisms. The development of artificial intelligence and machine learning tools for recruitment and evaluation presents both opportunities and risks for equitable hiring practices. These technologies can potentially eliminate human bias from selection processes while also encoding and amplifying existing discriminatory patterns if they are trained on historical data that reflects systematic exclusion practices. My team works closely with technology companies and research institutions to ensure that algorithmic hiring tools are designed and implemented in ways that promote rather than undermine diversity and inclusion objectives. This emerging field requires combining expertise in bias prevention with technical understanding of how automated systems operate and influence decision-making processes. The intersection of technology and equity represents one of the most important frontiers for contemporary diversity and inclusion work. As organizations increasingly rely on automated systems for recruitment, evaluation, and advancement decisions, ensuring that these tools operate fairly becomes crucial for maintaining progress toward equitable opportunities. Educational institutions have also begun incorporating lessons from our industry reform efforts into their curricula and career development programs. Business schools now offer courses on bias recognition and inclusive leadership that prepare future executives to create equitable organizational cultures from the beginning of their careers rather than trying to reform biased systems after they become established. My involvement in academic advisory committees allows me to contribute to the development of educational approaches that help emerging professionals understand both the technical aspects of their chosen fields and the cultural dynamics that influence career advancement and organizational success. These programs emphasize the importance of creating inclusive environments as a core competency rather than treating diversity as a separate initiative. The mentoring work that I do with students and early career professionals continues to be one of the most rewarding aspects of my current role. Each conversation reminds me of the isolation and frustration I felt during my own job search while also demonstrating how much support systems and resources have improved for emerging professionals facing similar challenges. Young professionals today have access to networks, resources, and advocacy organizations that simply didn't exist when I was navigating systematic barriers alone. While bias hasn't been eliminated, the increased awareness and accountability mechanisms mean that discriminatory practices are more likely to be identified and challenged before they destroy careers or perpetuate institutional exclusion. The transformation of industry culture around diversity and inclusion has created career opportunities that didn't exist when I was beginning my professional journey. Organizations now recognize that expertise in bias prevention and inclusive leadership represents valuable capabilities that contribute to overall organizational success rather than compliance obligations. Looking toward the future, I'm optimistic about continued progress while remaining realistic about the persistence of systematic barriers that require ongoing attention and adaptive strategies. The reforms we achieved in financial services demonstrate that entrenched discrimination can be challenged and changed through coordinated advocacy, legal accountability, and sustained organizational commitment. However, the work of creating genuinely equitable professional opportunities will likely continue for many years as new forms of bias emerge and legacy practices evolve to avoid obvious detection. Maintaining progress requires persistent vigilance and continued innovation in identifying and addressing systematic barriers before they become as entrenched as the practices we successfully challenged. The personal transformation that resulted from my experiences with discrimination and advocacy has been profound and ongoing. What began as a desperate attempt to understand why qualified candidates were being systematically excluded evolved into expertise in organizational change and systematic reform that has shaped every aspect of my professional identity. The journey from rejection to advocacy taught me that individual experiences of injustice can reveal broader systematic problems that require collective action to address effectively. My personal struggles with biased hiring practices were ultimately transformed into opportunities to create meaningful change that benefits countless other professionals facing similar barriers. The business card that Marcus Thompson pressed into my hand in that parking garage 8 years ago didn't just change my career trajectory, it connected me to a community of advocates and reformers who were committed to creating more equitable professional opportunities for everyone. Sometimes the most devastating rejections redirect us toward purposes we never could have imagined, and sometimes the people who seem to have the least power hold the keys to transforming entire industries. Today, my work continues to focus on ensuring that professional success is determined by qualifications and character rather than cultural assumptions or demographic preferences. The systematic barriers that once seemed insurmountable have been replaced by opportunities to create positive change, and the journey from exclusion to advocacy has been more meaningful than any position I originally sought at those biased firms. The ripple effects of our accountability efforts continue to expand as new generations of professionals enter industries that are more equitable and inclusive than they were just a decade ago. While the work is far from complete, the progress demonstrates that systematic change is possible when individuals find their voices, allies emerge to support truth-telling, and institutions are held accountable for their practices. The invitation arrived on crisp ivory paper with elegant gold lettering, requesting my presence at the 10th anniversary celebration of the Financial Services Equity Initiative. As I held the invitation in my hands, memories flooded back to that first devastating rejection at Apex Financial Partners that had set everything in motion. The event would be held in the same building where I had once been humiliated, now transformed into a symbol of progress and accountability. The anniversary celebration would bring together hundreds of professionals whose careers had been shaped by the reforms we had fought so hard to achieve. Young executives who had benefited from bias-free hiring practices would share the stage with industry veterans who had embraced cultural transformation despite their initial resistance. The evening would honor Marcus Thompson, Patricia Wong, and other courage catalysts whose willingness to speak truth to power had created ripple effects throughout multiple industries. Preparing for the event required reflecting on how dramatically the landscape had changed since those early days of systematic exclusion and coded discrimination. The financial services industry now boasted leadership teams that reflected the diversity of their client base, while advancement opportunities were increasingly based on demonstrated competence rather than cultural compatibility assessments that had once served as gatekeepers for institutional bias. The transformation hadn't been without setbacks and ongoing challenges. Some firms had initially implemented superficial changes designed to avoid legal liability while maintaining exclusionary practices through more subtle mechanisms. Others had experienced pushback from employees who felt threatened by cultural shifts that challenged their assumptions about merit and professional qualifications. Creating sustainable change required persistent effort and adaptive strategies that evolved as new forms of bias emerged. Walking into the celebration venue felt surreal after so many years of advocacy work and organizational transformation. The same marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had once intimidated me now seemed welcoming, decorated with banners celebrating diversity achievements and professional excellence. The guest list included executives from firms that had once rejected qualified candidates based on cultural assumptions, now proudly showcasing their inclusive leadership teams and equitable advancement practices. Marcus Thompson was being honored as the evening's keynote speaker, his journey from custodial supervisor to organizational change consultant representing one of the most dramatic career transformations to emerge from our accountability efforts. His speech would focus on the power of unexpected allies and the importance of speaking up against injustice regardless of one's position within institutional hierarchies. Watching Marcus command the attention of hundreds of industry leaders reminded me of that pivotal moment in the parking garage when he had pressed Patricia Wong's business card into my hand. His courage in documenting systematic discrimination from his unique vantage point had provided the insider evidence needed to expose coordinated bias practices that might otherwise have remained hidden for decades longer. The evening's program included testimonials from young professionals whose careers had been launched through reformed hiring practices that emphasized merit over cultural fit assessments. Their stories highlighted how individual opportunities had been transformed by systematic changes, while also demonstrating the ongoing need for vigilance against emerging forms of bias that continued to evolve as organizations adapted their exclusionary strategies. Sarah Kim, the Berkeley graduate I had mentored several years earlier, was now a rising star at Pacific Investment Partners, where she led a team developing innovative sustainable investing strategies. Her presentation about building diverse investment portfolios that outperformed traditional approaches demonstrated how inclusion initiatives had created both social impact and superior financial returns for forward-thinking organizations. The celebration also acknowledged the broader network of advocates, journalists, legal professionals, and organizational leaders who had contributed to cultural transformation efforts across multiple industries. Patricia Wong's investigative reporting had inspired similar accountability projects in healthcare, technology, consulting, and academic institutions, creating a national conversation about systematic bias that had influenced policy development at federal and state levels. Jessica Martinez's consulting firm had expanded to include offices in 5 major cities, working with organizations across various sectors to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategies. Her success demonstrated how expertise developed through lived experience with discrimination could be translated into valuable professional capabilities that benefited entire industries and communities. Maria Santos had been appointed to the Federal Task Force on Employment Discrimination, where her legal expertise and advocacy experience informed policy recommendations that strengthened enforcement mechanisms and expanded protections for professionals facing systematic bias. Her work contributed to landmark legislation that increased accountability requirements for organizations receiving government contracts and federal funding. The anniversary celebration featured an interactive exhibit documenting the timeline of reform efforts, from Patricia's initial investigation through the comprehensive settlements and policy changes that had transformed industry practices. The display included recorded testimonials from hundreds of professionals whose careers had been impacted by systematic bias, creating a powerful archive of experiences that would inform future advocacy and education efforts. One particularly moving section of the exhibit featured handwritten letters from recent graduates who had found meaningful employment through reformed hiring practices. Their gratitude was profound, but their stories also highlighted how normalized discrimination had become before our accountability efforts forced institutional change. Many described feeling grateful for opportunities that should have been available based on merit alone, revealing how deeply systematic bias had shaped expectations and career aspirations. The evening's most emotional moment came when Marcus Thompson introduced his daughter, who had recently graduated from Stanford Business School and accepted a position at the same investment firm where he now served as Director of Workplace Equity. Her success represented generational progress, as she entered a professional environment that had been transformed by her father's courage and the collective advocacy efforts of countless individuals who had refused to accept systematic injustice. During the reception following the formal program, I found myself in conversation with Victoria Sterling, the Apex Financial Partners executive who had rejected my candidacy a decade earlier. Her presence at the celebration reflected genuine transformation rather than mere compliance with industry expectations, as she had become a vocal advocate for bias prevention and inclusive leadership development. Victoria's acknowledgement of past mistakes was direct and meaningful, focusing on systematic problems rather than individual decisions while accepting responsibility for her role in perpetuating discriminatory practices. Her current work involved training other executives to recognize and interrupt bias in real time, drawing on her own experiences to help others understand how easily intelligent professionals could be influenced by systematic prejudices. The Conversation with Victoria highlighted how comprehensive reform required engaging both victims and perpetrators of systematic bias in collaborative efforts to create sustainable change. While accountability for past discrimination remained important, transformation also required bringing former opponents into advocacy roles where their influence and expertise could contribute to ongoing progress. The anniversary celebration concluded with the announcement of a new scholarship fund that would support diverse students pursuing careers in financial services. The fund had been established through contributions from firms that had participated in discrimination settlements, creating ongoing investment in pipeline development and educational opportunities for underrepresented communities. The scholarship program would be administered through a partnership between industry organizations and academic institutions, ensuring that selection criteria emphasized academic excellence and professional potential while actively recruiting candidates from diverse backgrounds. The initiative represented evolution from reactive accountability toward proactive investment in systemic change that would benefit future generations of professionals. Driving home from the celebration, I reflected on how individual experiences of rejection and discrimination had ultimately contributed to transformation that extended far beyond personal career advancement. The systematic barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been replaced by opportunities for meaningful advocacy and organizational change that created value for entire industries and communities. The journey from devastating rejection to industry leadership had taught me that setbacks often redirect us toward purposes we never could have imagined. If Apex Financial Partners had hired me based on merit rather than cultural assumptions, I might have built a successful but conventional career without ever discovering my passion for equity advocacy and systematic reform. The unexpected allies who emerged during our accountability efforts had demonstrated that courage and integrity could be found in surprising places when institutional injustice became too obvious to ignore. Marcus Thompson's willingness to risk his employment security for principle had provided crucial evidence that might otherwise have remained hidden, while Patricia Wong's journalistic integrity had ensured that complex systematic bias was documented and exposed with appropriate care and accuracy. The ongoing work of creating equitable professional opportunities continues to evolve as new challenges and opportunities emerge. Technological advances, generational shifts, and changing economic conditions require adaptive strategies that build on past progress while addressing contemporary forms of bias and exclusion. My current role involves anticipating future challenges and developing proactive solutions rather than simply responding to discrimination after it occurs. This forward-thinking approach includes working with educational institutions to prepare emerging professionals for inclusive leadership, collaborating with technology companies to ensure algorithmic fairness in hiring systems, and partnering with policy organizations to strengthen legal frameworks for employment equity. The transformation that began with systematic bias documentation has created a legacy of accountability and reform that continues to influence professional practices across multiple industries. While the work is far from complete, the progress demonstrates that persistent advocacy and collective action can overcome even deeply entrenched institutional discrimination. The business card that changed everything still sits framed on my office wall, a reminder that unexpected connections and courageous individuals can catalyze transformation that extends far beyond personal circumstances. Sometimes the most devastating rejections become the foundation for purposes that create lasting positive change for countless others facing similar challenges. The ripple effects of our accountability efforts continue to expand as new generations of professionals enter industries that are more equitable and inclusive than seemed possible just a decade ago. Their success validates the sacrifice and persistence of everyone who refused to accept systematic injustice as an unchangeable reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.